Hello, this is James, or Professor Goodyear, here again. Today, I'm going to be reading to you one of my essays written for a university class on the history of India. It was a survey course, which means it covered a large amount of time, basically from ancient Indian history and prehistory up to more or less the present day. This essay was written on the Bengal famine of 1943, specifically speaking about how British colonial policy in the early 40s and during the Second World War contributed to the tragedy. So, without further ado, I'll begin reading. Oh, wait, I should probably mention that I wrote this paper about a year ago now. So, please excuse the ungodly amount of footnotes I use. This heavily researched paper, and is actually part of my writing that I'm trying to work on this year, is organizing my papers in a way that I don't have to use as many footnotes as I do. So, let's get started. Despite resulting in the deaths of an estimated 3.5 million people, more than half the amount of Jews that died in the Holocaust, the Bengal famine of 1943 has been left relatively undiscussed in historiographic literature. The primary reason for this is the well-grounded accusation that Prime Minister Winston Churchill, his war cabinet, and the British imperial government in India were culpable for allowing the famine to intensify through gross negligence and policies that were actively disadvantageous to Bengal's economy and food supply. For instance, a reading of 17 popular Churchill biographies shows that the Bengal famine is usually only mentioned briefly, if at all, and certainly lays no blame on Britain's wartime Prime Minister. Conservative and Eurocentric historians are hesitant to blame the administration of a figure revered as an ideal leadership role model. From the start, as expressed by the Famine Inquiry Commission, established by the British colonial government to investigate the Bengal famine, many believed the famine's high mortality rate was man-made and resulted from a failure of those in power to make food available where it was needed. Though the British government shifted the blame for many years to natural causes like droughts and cyclones, the consensus among most academics today remains that the famine was primarily a man-made disaster. Therefore, rather than debate the validity of this consensus, it is crucial to determine why Churchill and his administration allowed the famine to unfold. While Churchill and his administration did not actively incite the Bengal famine of 1943, policy decisions informed by the ongoing Second World War, racism, and Indian nationalism facilitated its exacerbation. War provided an excuse for gross negligence and the diversion of shipping to other war-affected countries. Racism underlined this negligence and promoted a focus on helping white nations instead. And Indian nationalism fosters hesitancy, as even positive dealings with the Indian people could encourage their push for independence. Firstly, the Second World War remained the primary focus for Churchill and his administration. stocks continued to leave India in droves. Experts estimate that rice exportation was one of the primary reasons for the famine, and yet rice exportation did not cease until the end of July 1943, several months into the catastrophe. Even as signs of famine presented themselves, the colonial authorities averted taking the proper precautions in favor of the continued feeding of the military effort. Churchill and his associates considered it more important to feed liberated European countries instead. For example, Australian ships carrying over 100,000 tons of storage, including food, frequently bypassed India on their way to Southern Europe. This practice was common for Churchill, who continuously diverted potential food and medical aid away from Bengal, including rejecting an offer of wheat from Canada and turning down Australia's offer to use a surplus of 4 million tons of wheat and meat supplies. Moreover, the War Cabinet refused to slow the buildup of domestic stockpiles as well, even though the UK's civilian stockpiles would grow so much during the war that they would reach 18.5 million tons by the end of 1943, their highest total ever, and with a population 14 million fewer than Bengal's. Even with this incredible stockpile, when Viceroy of India, Archibald Wavell, continued to ask Britain for imports of grain in the first few months of 1944, the British government offered only 400,000 tons of wheat, far from the amount needed to serve a starving and disease-ridden population, and astoundingly demanded 150,000 tons of rice in return. The hoarding of such a large amount of grain, Churchill argued, was essential for safeguarding domestic provisions in anticipation of shortages after the war. Nevertheless, such policies showed a blatant disregard for the lives of Bengali people in service of a better supplied domestic and allied war effort. Churchill and his administration also introduced policies that, while unintentional, more actively sabotaged Bengal's access to food. For example, the year before the famine, Churchill initiated a scorched earth campaign in coastal Bengal. Sorry, I just yawned. In coastal Bengal, to dissuade Japan from invading India. Authorities removed boats and destroyed or confiscated rice stocks. However, Japan invaded Burma, a neighboring colony of the British Empire, anyways. So the only thing this denial policy really accomplished was depriving Bengal's agriculturalists of their means of income, and without as many boats, making it harder to transport grain around and thereby increasing its already war-inflated price. All of this happened right before the outbreak of the famine the following year. Furthermore, seen as dangerous to military considerations, the British government censored the media to prevent widespread public awareness of the famine. Namely, it might have incentivized Japan to invade Bengal while it was weak, knowing Bengal had become a primary supplier of war resources. More broadly, it might have distracted the home front's focus on the war by turning their attention to Bengal's humanitarian crisis. The Bengal famine only became popular news in September 1943. The Bengal famine only became popular news in September 1943, after the press published images of the starving victims. Consequently, several non-governmental relief organizations stepped up to fill the British government's lack of action, in addition to an increase in public donations to alleviate the crisis. If the British imperial administration had made the public aware of the impending crisis sooner, such organizations might have been better prepared to prevent or alleviate the worst of the suffering. It might have even compelled the government to act on the crisis itself to save face. After all, the change in public opinion following September 1943 motivated the British government to finally address the emergency in November by deploying the Royal Air Force to deliver food and medical relief. Nevertheless, the British government's prior refusal to acknowledge the crisis and the apparent interest of the war allowed it to exacerbate beyond reversibility. Revealingly, racism underlined the British government's refrain when dealing with the famine. Churchill, as evident through multiple excerpts, disliked the Indian race. For example, Amory recorded in his diary Churchill saying in private conversation, "I hate Indians. They are beastly people with a beastly religion. The famine was their own fault for breeding like rabbits." Churchill's beliefs are reflected in his policies, with his continued denial to allow food and medical aid shipments to Bengal throughout the war, despite the resources to do so. One can easily attribute Churchill's wanton ignorance of the extent of the famine to his view of the white man as superior. He is on record for saying regarding colonial control of the subcontinent that he does not admit that wrong has been done to the Indian people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race has come in and taken their place. For instance, Churchill excluded India from applying for aid from the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, a branch of the UN that helped feed countries affected or displaced by war. Churchill's decision here marks a particular hatred for Indians, as other East Asian countries were nevertheless prioritized. As the British representative for the UN, Colonel John L. Llewellyn argued that India was not a victim of war. This despite the obvious fact that Japan invaded neighboring Burma, many Indian soldiers served in the conflict, and the Bengal famine itself was compounded by wartime inflation and exploitation of India's food and resources. Meanwhile, liberated and allied countries in Europe received plenty of aid from Britain throughout the war without discrimination, including Greece, which concurrently went through a famine of its own. Wavell, Viceroy of India in 1943, wrote an account of his meetings saying, "Apparently, it is more important to save the Greeks and liberated countries than the Indians, and there is reluctance either to provide shipping or to reduce stocks in this country." Such overt indifference to the plight of the Bengali people, in contrast to Britain's care for Europe, cannot be divided from Churchill and his associates' evident discrimination of the Indian race. Predictably, British public health policy in India primarily served British civilians and the army. Indians had to deal with an inadequate health care system, poor infrastructure, and a lack of working irrigation facility, all while residents of British origin received preferential treatment. This improperly assembled healthcare system could not contend with cholera and malaria outbreaks that struck the starving population of Bengal in 1943, with malaria incidences, for example, reaching a height of 51.7% in November, striking an unneeded yet astronomical death toll. Absent this underlying racist negligence, the British government could have averted these deaths. On August 4, 1944, Amory wrote in his journal, "I didn't see much difference between Churchill's outlook and Hitler's, which annoyed him no little. I am by no means sure whether on this subject of India he is really quite sane. There are few greater signifiers of racist motivations than to be compared to Hitler by a close political associate." Finally, dealing with India could have promoted Indian nationalism, and Churchill had no interest in granting India its independence. Notably, the Quit India movement, a movement vying for India's sovereignty, was concurrently transpiring. British authorities operated under the knowledge that Churchill intended to keep India as a colonial possession after the war, and were also worried that Indian nationalism would interfere with India's dedication to the war effort through the provision of resources, labor, and volunteer soldiers. Consequently, the British government held positive or negative dealings with India in precarious balance. For instance, allowing rice to be shipped from Japanese-occupied Burma to starving Bengal was avoided as a potential admission of weakness on the part of the imperial administration. Thus, it was more critical to Churchill and his administration to maintain an image of strength, to prolong the British Empire, than to help Bengalis in need. In many British eyes, including Churchill's, the Quit India movement made Indians less worthy of aid. In keeping with this approach, Viceroy of India, Linlithgow, in response to growing nationalism, ordered the arrest of the leaders of the pro-nationalist Congress Party in 1942, including revolutionary leader Mahatma Gandhi. Consequently, when the Bengal famine began, leaders of the Congress Party were in prison and could not adequately respond to the crisis themselves. Counteracting Indian nationalism also played a part in the British government's attempted media censorship and downplay of the famine. For example, Emery went to great lengths to minimize the extent of the catastrophe, criticizing the British press wherever they gave the famine attention, fearing it would give the public a misleading impression of its nature. This so-called misleading impression could have led to extended calls for independence as the failures of the imperial administration in Bengal became clear. Ironically, the British government's inaction in Bengal and their attempted minimization of the famine only increased nationalist sentiment anyways. For example, Indian nationalist associations came together to portray the Bengal famine as proof of the inefficiency of British colonial rule. Nationalists and anti-imperialists' increasingly vocal presence through mediums like pamphlets, posters, rallies, and the printed press played a big part in forcing the British government to acknowledge the crisis more significantly. Despite growing awareness, Emery nevertheless continued to shift the responsibility of the famine to profiteering and hoarding rather than government inaction. However, attacks against Emery for this negligence became so great that he could not visit his constituency in Sparkbrook, Birmingham, without endangerment from angry protesters. Furthermore, the involvement of non-official relief organizations, following increased public awareness, made it especially difficult for the British government to ignore the extent of the famine any longer. Thus, whereas before the government avoided acknowledging the famine to conceal signs of imperial weakness from the nationalist movement, now they were obliged to deal with the famine to forestall the rise in nationalist sentiment anyways. In fact, it was a primary motivator. The British government concentrated on fabricating a positive image of their delayed relief efforts. For instance, when Viceroy Linlithgow finally asked for 300,000 tons of food grain in June 1943, he concluded his telegram by saying, "The propaganda value of this would be great indeed." Meanwhile, the British government continued to blame the famine on the Bengalis, this time for supposedly overeating stored remnants before the famine began, and formulated heroic depictions in the press of Emery and Weevil's delayed actions against the famine. Even as the government capitulated aid, they maintained an image of imperial strength and Indian independence to ward off advocates of Indian autonomy. Without the perceived need to balance India's nationalist movement, the British government might have been less tentative about providing timely aid to Bengal. 2. Racism and Indian nationalism made Churchill and his administration reluctant to devote adequate attention to the Bengal famine of 1943. The Second World War served as an excuse for insufficient aid. Racism underlined the reluctance to provide aid in the first place, and Indian nationalism made the British government hesitant when dealing with India out of fear that they might push the subcontinent closer to independence. As a result of this reluctance, and not for the first time, millions of lives were needlessly lost under the British Raj's supervision. That the imperial government's poor handling of the Bengal famine played a part in India's eventual declaration of independence in 1947, the British Raj's atrociously handled the final act in India, its partition, led to the deaths of millions more. I'm sorry if you can hear my dog and my father upstairs. I hope it's not too loud. Thanks for listening or watching. Please put topic suggestions in the comments below. I believe I may add a link to my social media soon. Maybe not on this video,